Thank you for watching or viewing and listening to the Media and Society. Remember, we can't do it without you. So always link up, subscribe, and share when it comes to our content. We appreciate everything about you. Tonight's show is simply important. It's a topic that we can't seem to avoid here in the United States. And one of the things my brother and I have always wanted to do is really create a really international portion to what we do. And that means we go out and we seek people internationally to try to give us a different perspective on things. We can't be so insular as a culture here in the United States, especially in the Black community. We have to know that there are Black people in other parts of the world that are going through and fighting the good fight, just like we're doing here in the United States. And tonight, I want you guys to really get an opportunity to explore the topic of DE&I with a professional. So welcome to the Media and Society. We have critical conversations on issues and topics that are shaping our world. As I said before, I'm your host, Anthony Mitchell, and it's a vital and transformative topic that we're about to discuss: diversity, equity, and inclusion, commonly known as DE&I. Today, we're honored to be joined by a distinguished guest, Sophia Moreau. Sophia is a multi-award winning leader in the field of DE&I and the founder of Moreau Consulting. With over 20 years of experience, Sophia has dedicated her career to helping organizations foster inclusive cultures that drive innovation, improve employee well-being, and enhance overall performance. She has worked with numerous companies across various sectors to develop and implement effective DE&I strategies. In this episode, we'll explore the nuances of DE&I in the United States and the United Kingdom, examining how these concepts are implemented and the unique challenges each region faces. We'll also discuss innovative strategies and actions that professionals in both countries are employing to create more equitable and inclusive workspaces. But before we dive into these topics, let's take a moment to chat with Sophia about her journey and what she stands for. And without further ado, let's get started. How are you this evening, Sophia?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks so much for asking and for inviting me today, Anthony.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming. Can you start by telling the audience about yourself? How did you get into this? What drove you into this path in your life?
It's an excellent question. Sometimes I think that I always set out towards this path or the general direction and trajectory, but in reality, there were different moments of opportunity, and in some sense, I fell into it. So when I first started out, one of my earliest roles was as at the time it was called Equality and Diversity Advocate. We'll probably chat a bit later about how the language around DEI has changed quite a bit and the word equality isn't used as much in that same sense. At the time, it was a role that had a lot of autonomy. I was able to do quite self-directed projects. I think I ended up flying out to Denmark and doing a comparison between racial discrimination in the different education systems. And that was completely a project that I led on and designed and developed, but it was also extremely underpaid and very, very part-time, and there wasn't as much of a field in DEI, so to speak, at the time. I'd always had an interest in structural inequalities, really, whether it was racism or poverty or the mental health crisis. I always had an interest in unfairness and imbalances, but as time went on, the path began to emerge for me. So shortly after I was an equality and diversity advocate, which was in an education context, I then went on to become an external specialist, really. So I worked in communications, in journalism, and in lobbying and campaigning. So that was the angle that I then approached, trying to create change in terms of structural inequalities. So one of my recent roles was I was head of advocacy and communications at a child poverty charity. In another one of my roles, I was a deputy CEO and public affairs manager in a membership body that supports the nonprofit industry. And prior to that, I was a freelance journalist working on investigative journalism. But the golden thread for me was that I was trying to raise awareness of injustices, that I saw a pattern in terms of injustices of who was most regularly affected, and even on the injustices that are characteristic agnostics, shall we say, that there was a pattern amongst who was most affected and who had least access to participate in conversations and raise awareness of the struggle, essentially. Then, while I was in various roles, I began to realize, particularly as I began to do a bit more freelancing, as I became more senior, that the problem is also coming from inside the house, so to speak, as well. It was very rare that I would find environments that were, in fact, I would go as far as saying you never really find environments that are exempt from structural inequality and actually discrimination. And that's how I developed an interest in the internal side of DEI, the things that we associate typically with HR, in pay gaps, in workplace discrimination, in the progression and the promotions that don't happen, in who never gets through the door because their resume is thrown in the bin, or CV as we call it in the UK. That's it in a nutshell.
Interesting. That's great. Great information, Sophia. One of the things I want to tap into before we really dive in is you went into the world of entrepreneurship. So you saw that you had to do this and you didn't want to depend on doing it for another company. Can you tap into that a little bit and just kind of talk about that? What made you say, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and build my own consultancy doing this work?
Thank you for asking that, because similar to my journey more generally, with entrepreneurship in particular, I realized that I was always trying to create some role where I would be able to employ a wide range of tools and weapons, so to speak, to try and create change. And that role didn't really exist. Sometimes you get roles that grow around you, but often entrepreneurship sometimes provides people with an avenue of thinking bigger, of developing that working environment, developing that job description, creating that pathway that may not already exist yet. So I see internal, and by internal, I mean human resources, I mean organizational design. I also mean the cases that reach court sometimes, the internal and interpersonal workplace DEI as intimately connected to DEI in society, to addressing public health in an inclusive way. So I really wanted to set out to create a consultancy that looks at DEI holistically, that looks at trying to shape an inclusive and equitable future together. And I was also, on a personal level, really interested in what inclusive leadership could look like, in what a truly flexible workplace could be, where it isn't, we're doing you a favor because you're deviating from the norm and we're allowing you to work from home 2 days a week between the hours of 9 to 5, as long as you're available on tap. I wanted to see what it would look like if workplaces could be constructed from scratch in an inclusive way, which is what I'm trying to work on at Moreau Consulting. Let's see, because I too can fail, but entrepreneurship provided an exciting challenge.
Well, you won't fail. You're doing big things, doing great things, needed things. You won't fail. You know, you'll notice my brother and I, we don't believe in failure. So you're in the right place. So let's jump into this. So before we as we get started, how do you see the DE&I landscape in the UK differing from that in the US?
So while there are similarities, there are some very fundamental differences in the DEI landscape in the UK and the US. I would say that due to particularly the history in the US surrounding the civil rights movement, which had global impact and global inspiration, that meant that there was, for one, DEI more generally is heavily associated with racial inequality. In the UK as well, but particularly in the US, DEI is also associated quite heavily with, for example, the women's rights movement in the 1970s, a lot of sexual harassment, pro-choice legislation, etc. But DEI in the US is perhaps unique in that there is affirmative action, and there's quite a lot of landmark cases that are happening in very recent times surrounding this and rolling back some of that. But that is what I would say sets it apart quite heavily and also makes it a bit more tense. And there is more of a anti-DEI, essentially equalities work backlash happening in the US to an extent that is greater than in the UK. But because of the role of the US as a leading producer of media and the fast pace of information sharing in social media, this means that we're also seeing shadows and echoes of it in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. The UK, I would say, favors more the legal structure of the Equality Act, even though there isn't as much of a culture of litigation. There will be more of a focus on, was a law broken? If not, then has an inequality occurred? Even if there's the most progressive statements and such, unless there is some legal requirement behind it, it will be very rare that organizations will be held to account for falling below a social standard in the UK. And there is less of, in fact, quotas are illegal in the UK. They're considered positive discrimination, which is permissible. There is positive action, which is considered to be, for instance, having a statement at the bottom of a job description where you actively encourage people from an underrepresented group to apply for a role. But there isn't as much teeth behind it. And even those statements are seen by many organizations as, well, are we allowed to do that? Because there is such fear of breaching positive discrimination and falling into that territory of effectively quotas. So I would say that the UK is quite gun shy around DEI, and the US has a bit more of a straightforward and concrete history in that sense.
Gotcha. Let me ask you this, because one of the things like we always watch here in the US is you want to see, like, Black people in general, we tend to want to see their opportunity for Black leadership in corporations. How is it in the UK? Do you see that often, where you see a group of or just Black people in general, Africans or whatever, that are the leads of major corporations there? Or like you say, because you're saying there's not really a quota. So is there not a system in place to say, hey, that's a diversity hire, so to speak? Like in the US, we have diversity hires, so to speak.
In the UK, unfortunately, there is still the language of the diversity hire, even though there's so few of us. It's not uncommon to see industries that are 99% white in leadership, when that's not even reflective of the general population of the United Kingdom.
Gotcha.
The United Kingdom is 14% non-white, which is actually far greater in major cities, particularly London. But at the seat of power, that's where you see the greatest level of underrepresentation, and where there is also the greatest discomfort with actively considering that in recruitment processes, in essentially taking concrete steps to address underrepresentation. But yet we will still hear those allegations of diversity hire. We will also sometimes see organizations perhaps only considering the diversity of the people that they hire after there is a scandal surrounding discrimination of some kind.
Okay. And so, because here in the US, African Americans, we represent 14% of our population, right? So about 50 million people out of 350 million or something, maybe a little more than that, obviously. But in that 14%, we still represent very low numbers. And I'll just use information technology myself in the field that I'm in information technology. We're less than 3% in information technology leadership for most IT-based companies. That's here in the United States. And so I can only imagine going across the board. There was one report I read talking about surgeons, and they said Germany has the highest amount of African surgeons in the world, which was pretty phenomenal when I was thinking about it. And I mean, a lot of them come from Uganda. So I thought that was actually pretty cool information to find out as well. So how do you guys deal with that? You go into a hospital, are we going to see a good number of Black professionals as doctors, nurses, or it's the same thing as most corporations in the UK?
So hospitals are an interesting example, because a good amount of the racially minoritized populations in the UK came due to gaps in the workforce in the UK. So quite a lot of, for example, nurses will be women from the Caribbean, or women from the Philippines, or women from Africa. And there may even be overrepresentations in specific ethnic groups, such as, for instance, Zimbabweans in the care industry. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that that's at all represented in leadership or in senior clinical professions or on the board. Every single hospital trust and also the NHS itself and in its different departments does have boards that govern them. And some of the worst recruitment practices you will at times see at board level. So while you will see representation, it will tend to be very bottom heavy. And I'd argue that that's because that's where people are comfortable with diversity.
Mm. Mm. So, and one of the interesting thing too, I remember my sons told me when they came back, they say, Dad, one of the things we noticed about being over in UK, they were in Liverpool for a bit. They said it's very service. There's a lot of service driven, and you see people that are brown color in those jobs, in more of the service driven jobs, when they were going to restaurants or stores or whatever. I mean, he said same thing in Germany. He said, but Germany's a lot more insular. It's more of a white culture. So I thought it was interesting hearing it from a young person's perspective on how they saw it when they went to another country. What do you think are some of the unique challenges that you guys are facing when it comes to promoting DE&I in the UK?
There are so many challenges that it's challenging to narrow it down to just a few. I would say one is that people do think that seniority isn't the level at which you need to consider diversity, even though that is the level at which the rest of the organization will be reporting to. That's where people are going to access their management, their leadership, their guidance, the priorities and the strategy. That's where often the client-facing aims will come from. And people of color and other populations that are underrepresented are part of those wider audiences. It's just not taken seriously. Most often, diversity will be considered at internship level, at apprentice level, and at the levels at which you can perhaps access photographs for the website, for the brochure, but with no consideration of what roles will those people be progressing into. Another is that there will be lip service towards DEI, but then no consideration of the environments that people are being brought into, the cultures that they will be inhabiting, the extreme learning curve that they will fall casualty to, the lack of training, the lack of cultural awareness, the microaggressions that they will face when they come into companies. So there will be a look at diversity, particularly visible diversity that makes a company look better, with no consideration of what is the experience of those people, forcing those people who may not have intended to do any type of DEI work, but just wanted to do their jobs, becoming or needing to become the expert with no additional pay, of course. So those are some of the challenges. Another challenge is the lack of at times compulsion behind it, because the rights in the UK to address discrimination, while they are good in some senses, they are so slim on the ground as far as recourse. People only have 3 months minus 1 day from the date of the discrimination itself to ever take action legally. And that's just inaccessible for the overwhelming majority of people. And how does that incentivize companies to operate in a way that is anti-discriminatory, let alone inclusive, let alone allyship or anti-racism?
So how are you with your consultancy, how are you guiding people to make these decisions to go and pursue legal aspects towards discrimination?
Excellent question. So the way that I approach it within my consultancy is split into about 3 different avenues. The majority of the work that we do is company facing. So I see that as the prevention work, because if you try and upskill the workforce, particularly leadership and HR and the functions that will be within the organization, and you audit the policies and the practices. So a big aspect of our work is auditing. And when I say auditing, I don't mean just looking at the policies and doing a desktop exercise, although that's part of it. It's also talking to people. It's holding safe spaces and discussions with people who are minoritized and from underrepresented groups and finding out what is their actual experience. And then translating that into recommendations that are evidence-based and also just informed, including informed about the experience of other people, not just the legal bare minimum. Another aspect of what we do is mediation, complaints investigation, because you do start to see the themes when you get to dig into individual situations and see how it plays out in action when things have gone wrong. And then the remaining aspect is awareness raising, because you can at times reach more people through that, and because work does need to be done on public awareness, public education, people understanding what their rights are so that you know to vindicate them or even know when they have been violated. And also pro bono anti-discrimination clinics to support people who have faced discrimination. And all of these aspects do feed in together, because then it enables you to future-proof an organization, looking at it from the perspective of people who may be facing discrimination there or in other similar environments, and increasing the strength and resilience of that organization. And it's a form of risk management. It's a form of employer branding.
Are you finding that companies, so I don't, so first let me ask this. So companies there, I'm assuming, have been establishing departments for diversity, equity, inclusion, because you used to work for one doing that. Are you finding that they are stripping them from the organizations like they're doing here in the US? As you can see in our news, they're doing it to our education segment. They're doing it to corporations that are starting to move on from it. They're saying, oh, we don't need it. Microsoft made a big announcement really about a week ago saying that they're dissolving their DE&I department, saying that they don't need it anymore. I mean, of course, technology needs it more than anything. The tech world's been as racist for the longest amount of time, as we all know. So are you finding that's happening in the UK or no?
It does happen in the UK as well, to less public an extent. So a very common thing that we were seeing was that many of the DEI roles that were being hired for, as we saw in the Summer of Solidarity in 2020, were fixed term and without necessarily the guarantee of renewal. So you'd see more 12-month, if very lucky, then perhaps 24-month fixed term contracts. But even in the people that were recruited permanently, many of them ended up leaving or resigning or being exited from organizations. And it wasn't uncommon for people to report, for example, that they had no headcount, no team, no meaningful budgets, a lack of autonomy and clear lines of accountability. So in some organizations, it would come through to, for example, DEI would sit within HR. In others, it might sit under compliance or under the legal departments. In some teams, it even sat under marketing. Or at times, it would be an undefined third thing that didn't have clear structure and at times even respect within an organization. So there would be difficulties within retention in DEI roles. We have seen, for example, particularly in the public sector, a complete lack of investment, or withdrawn investment in that area.
Okay, so explain to our audience what is considered minority in the UK, so they have a clear understanding.
So what is considered a minority in the UK? That's a challenging question, because at times people will say women, even though women are, for example, half of the population, in some places slightly greater than half. But really, I think what they're trying to say is underrepresented. Racial minorities will be quite often used, although in some areas or towns or perhaps audiences, it might be minority majority, so to speak. I like to use the term racially minoritized, for instance, because globally, people who are not white are the majority. And it's more the experience of being systemically excluded, the experience of being subjected to racism, that experience of minoritization, that is what should be highlighted a little bit more. So that's how I'm using the definition of minoritization. But when we speak of minorities, you could be a neuro minority, for instance. You could be someone with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, etc. You could be a neurodivergent person, so to speak. That's a neuro minority. You could be a disabled person, which is the only characteristic that absolutely anyone can obtain within their lifetime and is technically the largest minority group.
Okay. Now, tell me something that's been successful, a successful DE&I initiative throughout the UK. Since you've been doing this work, what have you noticed has gotten better?
What I've noticed improving is the initiatives for companies to look at what requirements are feeding that underrepresentation. Because it's very rare that it's not that rare, unfortunately. Let me correct myself. it's not as common for someone to be consciously and in a very black and white way discriminating and saying, absolutely not, we can't hire that person because of fill in the blank. More often it will be, of course, we need someone who has a degree in this area. Of course, we need someone who has worked in an identical organization before. Of course, we shouldn't list the salary, and we should instead say salary negotiable or salary based on past salary, because it's those everyday things that are more likely to lead to that extreme levels of underrepresentation and disproportionality. So what I found really successful in the UK was one campaign was to show the salary, and it placed pressure on organizations that are advertising vacancies to show the salary, to be transparent about pay. For one, because it means that particularly racially minoritized people and women and such are more likely to end up expressing salary expectations that are based on past salary. So it would reproduce pay inequalities. And two, because there is always a budget. Companies know what the budget is. Even if it's a pay scale, even if it's a ballpark, there is always a budget. And thirdly, because salary negotiable means who is going to be more likely to be able to negotiate or even have insight mentorship access to know to benchmark their negotiated salary against. Who is more likely to be seen as valuable in society or to that workplace and be seen as an authority and have their bargaining power reinforced. So I found the Show the Salary campaign incredible, and it has had measurable impact. Another successful campaign I saw was, one example is Non-Graduates Welcome, that really looked at how many different roles people are saying you need a degree for, or sometimes even stipulating what type of qualifications someone should have had at a school level, when that's more a reflection of what someone was going through at that time. And if we're talking a decade or more even down the line, how on earth is what they did 50 years ago in the education system when their life was perhaps least within their control of relevance to the department they may even be leading now? So I found those two initiatives, which aren't based on, for example, legal requirements or that bare minimum baseline, but are based on cultural changes in the workforce that can have a huge impact on our workforce demographics.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you something based on gender. You as a woman, when you hear what women go through in the workforce in the US versus the UK, can you sit back and say which one you feel seems to have it a bit easier? Is the fight a bit easier in the UK, or is the fight easier over in the US from what you just listened to from people?
This comes to mind all the time. I will say that the explicit nature of communication at times in the US can be a culture shock. Some of the things that you'll say as the comments that someone received in different workplace contexts will at times be more direct and more squarely falling into direct discrimination based on sex, for example. Mm-hmm. But that can actually mean that it is sometimes more straightforward for a person to exercise their legal rights because they have a black and white transgression. It was a line that was crossed, and rather than a pattern of events that you need to build up and demonstrate. Mm-hmm. However, the legal rights in the UK for women and for example, caregivers who tend to be women are stronger. The right to flexible working, for instance, to make a flexible working request, the protections around maternity, the fact that there is paid maternity leave in the UK, that just isn't a concept in the US. People sometimes think that they got a good deal when they get 10 weeks off at 50% pay. I had people telling me that they had to take, in order to access any meaningful maternity leave, which was, I think, a couple of months, it had to fall under basically disability-related leave.
Yep,
and that would be unheard of in the UK. Mm. However, people are more litigious in the USA. There is more of a culture of actually challenging things through the system. Like, oh, you should sue them is a common saying in the US. Yeah. Whereas in the UK, even in employment tribunals, you don't technically need to have a lawyer. If someone is unrepresented, then the system is supposed to make it accessible. And for example, the person has a duty to know the facts of their case. They're not expected to know the intricacies of the law, but there's still very low levels of litigation in the UK. And there's still very inequitable structures, like a 3-month deadline from the date of discrimination, whereas in the US, it's usually around 5 years. It varies, of course, due to the federal system, but it is around 5 years, which makes more sense when we consider how long it takes to process what's even happened to you, to get that advice. So the fight and accessing your rights where they do exist to challenge when something's gone wrong are, I'd say, perhaps stronger in the USA, but what we understand as what our rights should be, particularly in terms of gender and sex discrimination, is stronger in the UK.
That's great. That's great information. Hope people are definitely learning from this. Before we go to our first break, I want to ask you a question. Are you finding, because here there's a big push in the US for the youth that are coming out of school, hey, go into a trade, go back into a trade. They're making good money. Are you finding that that's happening in the UK as well, where they're pushing the trade as opposed to going for the degree and getting a degree-based job?
Absolutely. There is more of a push into not just the trades, but also into more practical professions, so to speak. However, there is also, interestingly, a push towards, in the UK, historically, you've been able to specialize in the subjects you want to do at around 16. So you don't need to, for example, continue English literature to the age of 18 if you know you want to do maths and science. And the inverse is also true. Now you need to do maths and English and certain topics up until the age of 18, and you also need to stay in the academic education system until the age of 18. Whereas in the UK, you could go into the trades, you could become an apprentice in, for example, construction at the age of 16 or so. So we're seeing a strange push where people are being encouraged towards more practical professions, and particularly encouraged away from the arts, and also being forced to stay in a more rigid education system to the age of 18.
Okay.
When there is criticism along DEI lines in particular that the emphasis on more technical professions and more practical, in quotes, professions, which we saw a rise of in the advertisements from the government during the coronavirus pandemic, would sometimes show, for example, a ballerina putting on her shoes. I think she may have even been a person of color, but I need to pull up that advertisement, who was putting on her shoes, and they said that her next career, could be in tech, and it had some link for like retraining and such.
Okay.
So we're already so underrepresented in certain fields that we tend to be who that language is directed towards. It's either often racial minorities or working class people. So it is quite concerning, unfortunately, when that underrepresentation is reinforced.
Okay. I'm telling you, there's so much I want to dive into, but we got to go for a break so we can pay some bills. Be back in 20. Thanks for watching this latest episode of the Media Society with Anthony Mitchell. Please like and subscribe, and of course, hit that notification bell to be notified when our latest content is posted for your viewing pleasure. Thank you to all of our subscribers and friends of the Media Society for your ongoing support. We see you and appreciate you. My name is Austin Mitchell, the host of the Review Show, where we run back some of the most impactful clips from past and present episodes of the Media Society and discuss their relevance in our society's discourse. We also have exclusive interviews with Anthony Mitchell and provide insight on upcoming projects before they drop from TMS Studios. The Media Society is more than a show, but a coalition of change in and throughout communities across the world. To learn more about us, please visit tmsstudiosllc.com, and you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. And of course, with that said, we're out.